The prairie was quiet that evening, save for the low whistle of the wind through the tall grass. Elizabeth, only 19, had been gathering firewood outside her family's cabin when the first shadow fell across her. She didn't even have time to scream before rough hands seized her arms, dragging her back toward the line of mounted warriors sweeping through her homestead like a storm. Her father's rifle cracked once, then twice, before a war cry split the air. By the time the smoke cleared, her father was gone, her mother silenced, and her world reduced to the pounding of hooves as she was carried away. The warriors tied her hands with rawhide and flung her over the back of a horse. She could hardly breathe. Pressed against the muscled back of the animal, her tears soaking into its hide. Fear knifed through her chest, not only for what had happened, but for what might yet be waiting. She had heard the stories, what warriors did to captive women, how they broke them until all that was left was shame. Elizabeth prayed those stories weren't true, even as dread told her they were. When the raiding party finally halted at dusk, the warriors made camp in a clearing surrounded by pine. They laughed, drank, and retold their victory in harsh voices that carried into the night. Elizabeth was thrown onto the ground near the fire, her wrists raw from the bindings, every nerve. And her body screamed with terror. She didn't dare cry out now. She had seen enough to know it would make her prey to their mockery. Instead, she bit her lip and watched, every muscle tense like a trapped doe. That was when he stepped forward. The leader. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face painted in black streaks that only made his eyes seem sharper, colder. He wore feathers braided into his hair, each one a mark of battles fought and enemies slain. He moved with a quiet power, a man who commanded without needing to raise his voice. When he looked at her, Elizabeth felt a shiver run through her. This was no ordinary warrior. He was their chieftain's blood, their fiercest protector, and perhaps their most dangerous man. Two younger braves jeered, shoving her toward him as if offering her like a prize of war. Her knees buckled in the dirt. She looked up, heart hammering, so loud she thought it might burst from her chest. His gaze swept over her once, unreadable. Then he crouched, close enough that she could see the faint scar running along his jaw. Elizabeth's breath came shallow. She knew what came next. The humiliation. The pain. Her mind screamed, "Don't let him touch you. Don't let him take everything." Desperation forced the words out of her throat before she could stop them. "Please, don't lift my skirt," she whispered, voice breaking. "I beg you." For the first time that night, the campfire seemed to crackle louder than the laughter. Her plea hung in the air, fragile but defiant, as though she had thrown a stone into the dark river of silence between them. The warrior's hand hovered near her, but something in her eyes stopped him. They weren't just wide with fear, there was fire in them too, a spark of unbroken spirit. He had seen captives cower, cry, even spit in rage, but never beg in such a way, not with a voice that carried both terror and dignity. He should have ignored it. Should have shown strength by taking what was his by right of conquest. But as he studied her trembling form, something unexpected stirred inside him. Not lust, not cruelty. Something he thought he had buried long ago. The other warriors watched, waiting for his decision. Elizabeth braced herself, trembling, knowing her words likely meant nothing. Yet the warrior did not move closer. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching across her like a cloak, then turned his back on her altogether. Elizabeth's chest tightened in confusion. He had spared her. But why? As the night deepened, she realized this man was not only her captor, but also the one who now held her fate in his hands. And though she did not know it yet, with that single whispered plea, she had stolen something from him. Something he would never reclaim. The camp had grown quieter by the time the moon lifted, its silver face above the treetops. Most of the warriors had drunk themselves into slumber, sprawled near the fire with empty gourds at their sides. A few still murmured, their voices low, but the laughter and jeers from earlier had faded into the night. Only the steady crackle of burning wood and the faint cry of an owl pierced the silence. Elizabeth sat on the ground, her wrists still bound, her skirt torn at the hem from being dragged. She wrapped her knees to her chest and rocked ever so slightly, trying to stay awake, trying to remind herself she was still alive. The firelight painted shadows across her pale face, catching in her wide, haunted eyes. She couldn't stop replaying what had almost happened. His hand, just inches from her, hovering with the power to destroy her dignity forever. And then, nothing. He had walked away, leaving her untouched, but not unharmed. Because the fear still coiled around her ribs like a serpent, squeezing tighter with every breath. And yet, beneath that fear, something else lingered: confusion. Why had he stopped? Men like him didn't yield to the pleas of captives. Everything she'd been told of warriors was that they took what they wanted without hesitation. Her whispered words, "Please, don't lift my skirt," should have meant nothing. But somehow, they had pierced through his iron will. He was watching her again. Elizabeth felt the weight of his gaze before she even looked up. He sat a few paces away, not sleeping like the others, his strong frame outlined against the flickering fire. His arms rested on his knees, and his dark eyes seemed to gleam, fixed on her. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering. Why? She whispered before she could stop herself. Her voice cracked in the night. "Why didn't you—" She couldn't even finish the sentence, shame burning her throat. The warrior didn't answer. His face remained carved from stone, but something flickered in his eyes, too brief for her to name. Perhaps he didn't know how to answer her himself. For him, the moment had been just as heavy. When her words had fallen on his ears, something deep inside him had stirred, something he had long buried under years of war, loss, and vengeance. He had been raised to believe that strength was proven through conquest, that mercy was weakness. Yet when her tear-streaked face turned up to him, begging with that frail but fiery voice, he had felt shame. He had not known shame since he was a boy. Elizabeth's plea had echoed in his mind like a prayer. "Please, don't lift my skirt." But it was her eyes that haunted him now. They had met his not with hatred, nor with empty pleading, but with a strange mix of defiance and purity. She had made him see himself through her gaze, and what he saw was a man teetering on the edge of something darker than he had realized. He should have turned away, should have hardened his heart again, but he could not. "Sleep," he finally said, his voice low, rough with an accent she struggled to follow. "No harm. Tonight." Elizabeth's breath caught. The words were broken but clear. She searched his face, looking for a trick, for malice. But there was none. Only a strange stillness, like a wolf caught between hunger and loyalty to its pack. She lowered her head slowly, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids. But she couldn't let herself rest fully, not yet. If he changed his mind, she would need to be ready. Across the fire, the warrior kept his vigil. He told himself it was only duty, that he was keeping watch because she was his captive, his responsibility. But deep down, he knew the truth. The plea of a fragile girl had pierced him in a way no weapon ever could. And though he had not touched her skirt, he feared something far greater, that she had already touched his soul. The days blurred together, long rides under an endless sky, nights spent huddled by fires, the rhythm of survival beating like a drum. For Elizabeth, each dawn brought the same question. Would today be the day he changed his mind? Would tonight be the night he took what she feared most? And yet, every day ended the same. He never touched her. He watched her, yes, always from a short distance, always with an intensity that unsettled her, but his hand never reached for her. Again. If anything, it was his silence that pressed on her most. Among the warriors, she began to notice things. The others laughed crudely, mocked their captives, boasted of their raids. But he remained apart, speaking little. His authority carried not in loud words, but in quiet control. When disputes arose, a single glance from him was enough to end them. When food was scarce, his men obeyed his division of portions without complaint. He was a man obeyed, even feared. Yet when his eyes turned to her, Elizabeth swore she saw not power, but something dangerously close to doubt. At first, she told herself it was her imagination, a trick of desperation, a way to cling, to hope. But the longer the days stretched on, the more she felt it. There was a bond forming between them. It lived in the silences. The way he handed her a water gourd without meeting her eyes. The way he always positioned himself near her when other men drew too close. The way she no longer flinched when his shadow fell over her. She hated it. She wanted to hate him. And yet, in some strange, quiet way, he was becoming the only anchor she had left. One evening, after a long ride, Elizabeth collapsed beside the fire, her body aching. She pressed her face into her knees, her shoulders trembling. She thought. She had been quiet, but when she lifted her head, she found his eyes on her again. "What do you want from me?" She whispered across the fire. Her voice was cracked but not weak. "Why haven't you—" Her words trailed off, shame burning her cheeks. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice low and halting, he said, "Not want that way." The words struck her harder than if he had shouted. She blinked at him, stunned, unable to form a reply. He looked away quickly, as though ashamed he had spoken at all. But the admission hung in the night air, fragile yet powerful. Elizabeth lay awake long after, staring at the stars, trying to understand. If he did not want her as men wanted women, then why keep her close? Why claim her? Why protect her from the others? She did not know the answer, but she felt it in her bones. Whatever bound him to her now, it was no longer conquest. For him, the struggle only deepened. Each time he looked at her, he remembered that first plea, the words that had seared themselves into his chest. "Please, don't lift my skirt. A warrior should not be moved by such weakness." And yet, it was not weakness he had seen. It was strength. A strength he could not bring himself to crush. The bond grew silently, like roots spreading beneath the soil, unseen but unbreakable. She was still his captive. But somehow, he was the one who could not escape. The wind swept low across the prairie that night, carrying the scent of smoke and pine. Elizabeth slept fitfully, curled beneath a rough blanket the warriors had tossed her way. The firelight flickered over her face, softening the lines of fear that usually hardened her features. The warrior, her captor, her protector, sat awake on the other side of the flames. Sleep rarely came to him, and when it did, it came in fragments, broken by dreams he could never outrun. Tonight was no different. His eyes, sharp in daylight, now carried a weight no one else could see. For Elizabeth, the silence was uncomfortable. For him, it was a battlefield. Memories came unbidden. He was a boy again, small hands gripping the bough his father had placed into them. His father's voice echoed, stern, unyielding. "Strength, son, never pity. Pity kills. Mercy weakens." He had believed it, swallowed the words whole, and carried them like scripture. But then came the night the bluecoats rode into their camp. Fire devoured their lodges, screams filled the air. He had been only 12 when he saw his mother struck. Down, her body crumpling into the dirt. His father fought until he fell, arrows bristling from his chest. By dawn, he was an orphan, his childhood buried beneath the ashes. From then on, there was only war, only survival. His people had taken him in, shaped him into a weapon. He had fought, killed, and never looked back. He had earned his place by hardening his heart until nothing could pierce it. At least, that was what he thought. Now, sitting by the fire, he watched the captive girl shift in her sleep, her lips parting as she murmured something soft. Perhaps a dream, perhaps a prayer. And something inside him cracked again. That night, when she had begged him not to lift her skirt, he had seen more than a frightened woman. He had seen himself, what he might have become if life had spared him its cruelties. The warrior pressed a hand against his chest, almost as if trying to steady the storm inside. Her plea had resurrected ghosts he had buried. His mother's voice, singing by the fire, his sister's laughter before sickness carried her away, the warmth of a family he had long lost. Elizabeth's trembling words had not been weakness. They had been a mirror, forcing him to confront the boy he once was. He hated it. And yet, he needed it. Across the flames, Elizabeth stirred and opened her eyes. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. She didn't speak, but in her eyes he saw the same question that had haunted him for days. Why me? He looked away, ashamed to answer what he couldn't understand himself. But inside, the truth burned, because in her, he saw the last piece of his soul he thought had died with his family. The warrior clenched his fists, torn between duty and desire, between what his people expected and what his heart demanded. He could not let them see this weakness. If they knew, they would call him unfit. If they suspected, they might take her from him and do the very thing he had spared her from. And so, he bore the battle in silence. Elizabeth lay awake long after, sensing the heaviness in him even without words. She didn't trust him. She wasn't sure she ever could, but she no longer saw him as just her captor. He was a man fighting wars she could not yet name, and somewhere deep inside her heart, she wondered if those wars might someday break him or save him. Elizabeth had thought captivity would be simple in its misery. She had imagined endless fear, constant terror, hatred so pure that it burned hotter than grief. And at first, it was. The night of her capture replayed in her mind over and over. The screams, the smoke, her father's final shout. Every time she looked at the warrior, her heart clenched with fury. If not for him, I would still have a family. If not for him, I would still be free. But life among the warriors was not what she had expected. She saw cruelty, yes. She saw men who mocked her, who would have broken her if given the chance. But she also saw children playing by the fires, women laughing as they cooked, elders speaking with quiet wisdom. The tribe was not only blood and war, it was life, lived harshly, but fully. And in the center of it all stood him, her captor, her shield, her torment. He was never far, always near enough to see, always watching. At first, his presence was a chain around her neck, reminding her she was nothing more than his prize. But the longer the days dragged on, the more that chain shifted into something else. A tether, yes, but one that kept others from reaching her. It shamed her to admit it, even to herself. She felt safer when he was near. The thought disgusted her. How could she find safety in the man who had dragged her from her home? How could she look into the eyes of her captor and feel anything but loathing? And yet, when she saw him rise to his feet at the first hint of threat, when she saw him stand, between her and the crueler warriors, her heart betrayed her. It leapt not with fear, but with relief. One evening, as the camp prepared for night, Elizabeth sat by the fire plucking burrs from the hem of her torn skirt. Across the flames, he sharpened his knife as always. The sound of stone against steel rasped through the quiet. "You confuse me," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to carry. The knife paused mid-stroke, His dark eyes lifted to hers. "You take me," she said, her throat tightening, "but you do not do what the others would have done. You guard me from them, but you still keep me bound." Her fingers trembled on the fabric. "I don't know if I should hate you or thank you." His gaze held hers for a long moment. Then, in his rough, halting English, he said only, "Hate is safer." Elizabeth's lips parted, but she found no reply. He returned to his knife, but his words echoed in her chest. Hate is safer. For him, for her, or both. That night, lying beneath the stars, Elizabeth turned those words over again and again. She wanted to hate him. She should hate him. But every time she tried, memories of his protection slipped through the cracks in her anger. And though she despised herself for it, she began to wonder if hate was truly the only path left to her. Her struggle deepened, pulling her in two directions. One path led to vengeance, to the cold fire of remembering her family and never forgiving. The other, she could not name. Not yet, but it frightened her more than captivity itself, because in that path lay the risk of seeing her captor not as a monster, but as a man. And if she allowed herself to see that, she feared she might lose the last piece of herself that was still free. The tension in the camp grew like a storm brewing over the plains. Whispers had begun among the warriors, low, biting remarks in their own tongue, glances cast toward Elizabeth when they thought the leader wasn't watching. His silence, his restraint, had not gone unnoticed. To them, a captive was a spoil of war, a symbol of victory, yet this one remained untouched, kept close, guarded fiercely, and the others began to resent it. Elizabeth felt it too. The way the younger braves lingered near her, testing boundaries with their eyes, waiting for the moment his back was turned. She knew her safety did not come from their mercy, it came from his presence alone. And she feared what would happen if that presence was ever challenged. That night, as firelight painted the camp in shades of orange and shadow, her fear came true. She was sitting by the flames, gnawing at a piece of dried meat, when two warriors approached. They were bold, with drink, their laughter sharp and ugly. One crouched beside her, his hand brushing too close to her leg. Elizabeth recoiled, clutching her skirt. "Pretty bird," one of them sneered in broken English. "Why does our chief keep you caged?" Elizabeth's heart pounded. She opened, her mouth to cry out, but the sound of boots crunching on dry earth cut her short. He was already there. The leader stepped between them, his presence like a wall of stone. His eyes burned as he leveled them with a look that froze the laughter in their throats. The two warriors exchanged glances, their smirks faltering. "She is ours too," one muttered, defiance lacing his tone. "Not only yours." The words were dangerous. Elizabeth knew it, even if she didn't understand their tongue fully. The others had begun to challenge him openly, testing his strength, questioning his right. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he drew the knife from his belt, not raising it, not threatening with wild gestures, but holding it steady, gleaming in the firelight. The message was clear. The camp hushed, all eyes turning. A standoff. Elizabeth held her breath. One of the younger braves spat into the dirt, but neither dared move closer. At last, with muttered curses, they backed away, disappearing into the shadows. The warrior she feared, and now relied upon, watched them go, his body taut with fury. When he turned back to her, Elizabeth thought for a moment he might be angry with her, that he might blame her for the scene. Instead, he simply sheathed his knife and knelt beside her. "You are safe," he said in his rough accent, his voice low but steady. Her throat tightened. For the first time since her capture, tears slid down her cheeks, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of his words. Safe. In a place where she should have been anything but. but safety had cost him something. She saw it in the eyes of the others, in their narrowed gazes and hushed whispers. By protecting her so fiercely, he had marked himself, not as a strong leader, but as a man whose judgment could be doubted, a man whose weakness had been exposed. That night, Elizabeth lay awake, the stars wheeling overhead. She realized what had just happened was more than protection. It was defiance. He had chosen her over the approval of his own people. And with that choice, the path ahead grew dangerous. For him, for her, for both. Because in that moment, he had not only defended her body, he had declared without words that her life mattered more to him than the bond he shared with his warriors. The balance had tipped. The storm was no longer brewing. It had begun. Dawn came quietly, with pale streaks of gold bleeding into the sky. The camp stirred slowly, fires stoked, horses watered, warriors preparing for the day's ride. Elizabeth sat apart, her hands unbound now, but her ankles loosely tied with rawhide. She kept her eyes low, watching the dust swirl in the morning light, trying to make herself invisible. But her thoughts were anything but still. The memory of last night burned behind her eyelids. She had begged, pleaded with trembling lips, and instead of cruelty, she had been met with restraint. Yet the man who spared her had not looked kind. His eyes were sharp, troubled, as though he too warred against something unseen. The uncertainty of it all unsettled her even more. He was near again. She could sense him before she even lifted her gaze. The warrior, tall, broad, his hair tied back with a strip of leather, feathers brushing his shoulders, stood with arms crossed, watching his men. But his eyes shifted to her often, as if against his will. Inside him, the conflict raged. When Elizabeth had begged him not to lift her skirt, he had felt a crack deep within the armor he had spent years forging. He told himself it was weakness, that he should have silenced her voice and proven his dominance. That was what was expected of him. Mercy was not a trait celebrated among warriors, it was despised. And yet he could not bring himself to break. Her words had been soft, but her gaze had burned into him like fire. In that single moment, he had seen himself reflected in her eyes, not as the fierce protector of his people, not as the hardened fighter he pretended to be, but as something hollow, dangerous, and lost. And it shamed him. He remembered battles, past, villages set aflame, enemies struck down without hesitation. He had taken lives without blinking, had seen women cry out and ignored them. But this one, this girl with her pale skin smudged by ash, with her trembling hands and defiant eyes, she had undone him with a whisper. Why? He asked himself again and again. Why had he stopped? Was it pity? No. Pity was for the weak. Was it fear? No. He feared no man, no woman, no spirit. Then what was it? The warrior's chest tightened as he looked at her now, seated by the fire, her torn dress brushing her ankles, her chin trembling as she tried not to cry. Something inside him, something buried so deep he had forgotten it existed, ached. He had thought his soul long dead, drowned in the river of blood and smoke that had been his life. But her words had pulled it from its grave. One of the younger braves noticed his stare and laughed cruelly, making a jest about the captive. Heat flared in the warrior's chest. He silenced the man with a single glance, his authority unquestionable. But inside the laughter rang like an accusation. They would not understand. Perhaps he did not understand. Elizabeth dared a glance, up, catching his eyes. For a moment, neither looked away. There was no trust in her gaze, only confusion and a flicker of something else. Not forgiveness? Not yet. But curiosity. The warrior's jaw tightened. He turned abruptly and walked toward the horses, needing distance, needing air. He could not allow this, whatever it was, to take root. She was a captive, He was her captor. That was the order of things, and yet, as the morning sun climbed higher, he knew a truth he could not bury. The battle he faced now was not against rival tribes or soldiers. It was against himself, and he was losing. The march resumed under a blazing sun. Dust rose from the horses' hooves as the warriors moved in a loose line across the open prairie. Elizabeth walked, her ankles untied now, but her wrists still bound. A tether rope looped loosely in the warrior's hand. To the others, it was a practical restraint. To her, it was a chain reminding her of captivity. But there was something different about the way he held it. He never yanked, never jerked her forward like the others did with their captives. Instead, his pace matched hers. When she stumbled on a loose stone, the rope slackened rather than tightened. It was a subtle thing, but she noticed, and it made her wonder if he was protecting her, or protecting himself. By midday, the band stopped at a stream to rest. Warriors splashed their faces, drank deeply, and let their horses graze. Elizabeth lowered herself to the bank, cupping cool water into her mouth. The warrior, her captor, stood nearby, his shadow falling long across her. She wanted to hate him, but she could not deny the strange safety his presence brought compared to the others. It was as though, without words, he had drawn a line. None would touch her but him, and yet he had not touched her. When two younger braves wandered too close, smirking at her torn skirt, Elizabeth's heart pounded. She backed away, but before she could cry out, the warrior was there, stepping between them and her. His face was hard, his voice a low growl that carried warning. The braves muttered and backed off, shooting her lingering looks, but they didn't dare challenge him. Elizabeth stared at his back, her breath catching. He hadn't looked at her, hadn't spoken to her, but his actions had spoken louder than words. Something shifted in that moment. She realized he wasn't guarding her out of duty alone. He was making a choice. Every time he stopped himself from asserting dominance, every time he blocked another man from coming near, he was ceding a kind of power to her. Not openly, not in front of his people, but inside himself. And he knew it too. Later, when the sun dipped low and the camp was made again, Elizabeth was given a scrap of food, dried meat, rough bread. She ate slowly, her eyes flicking to him. He sat apart, sharpening his knife with long measured strokes, but his gaze strayed to her more often than he intended. The knife rasped against stone, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He could not understand this pull toward her. Captives were meant to be broken, to remind the tribe of their strength. And yet, when he looked at her, all he felt was the memory of her voice, trembling yet strong, begging him not to lift her skirt. That moment had stolen his certainty, replaced it with doubt. Elizabeth caught his eyes once. For the first time since her capture, she did not look away immediately. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. Something unspoken passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but a recognition that the balance of power was no longer what it seemed. She was his captive in body, yes, bound by rope, forced to march where he led. But in his heart, the chains were his. Every time he restrained his hand, every time he spared her dignity, she held him tighter than rawhide ever could. When night fell, Elizabeth lay awake under the stars. Fear still wrapped around her, but another thought crept in, unsettling in its own way. Why is he protecting me? And across the fire, the warrior sat in silence, staring into the flames. He could not bring himself to admit the truth, even in the quiet of his own mind. She had already begun to undo him. The camp was no longer the same. Since the night he had drawn his knife against his own men, a silent rift had split through the band of warriors. Elizabeth could feel it in every sideways glance, every hushed word that stopped when he approached. Some obeyed him still out of loyalty, others out of fear. But she knew, as did he, that the moment he protected her, he had crossed an invisible line. He had chosen her once. Now he would have to choose again. The journey grew heavier. Each mile across the prairie pressed down on them like an unseen weight. Elizabeth walked at his side, the rope still tied loosely around her wrists. But she could sense it wasn't just her body bound. It was his soul, pulled taut between two worlds. At night, when the others slept, she sometimes caught him watching her. Not with the hunger she had once feared, but with something more dangerous: conflict. He was a man torn in half, and she was the cause. That knowledge terrified her. One evening, as the tribe made camp in the shadow of red cliffs, the tension broke. A council of elders gathered around the fire, their voices low but sharp. Elizabeth could not understand their words, but the tone was unmistakable: accusation. One of the younger braves gestured toward her, his voice rising, her heart pounded. She didn't need translation. They were questioning why she was still untouched, why she was still alive. The warrior stood tall, answering them with words clipped and firm. His voice carried authority, but she heard the strain in it. His people were not convinced. To them, mercy was weakness, and weakness could not lead. Elizabeth's stomach twisted as the elders' gazes turned to her. She felt like a deer surrounded by wolves, waiting for the strike. Then his voice cut through the circle again, louder this time, final. He ended the discussion with a command, and though the others fell silent, their eyes burned with resentment. Later, when the fire had died low, Elizabeth found herself beside him, the night air cool against her skin. She swallowed hard, then whispered, "Why do you keep me?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a long time he said nothing. Then finally, in halting words, he answered, "If I let you go, they kill you. If I keep you, they turn against me." His gaze shifted to the stars. "Either way, I lose." The weight of his words sank deep into her chest. He was caught in a snare of his own making, and she was the bait. "You could still give me back," she said softly. "To safety, to my people." His head turned sharply, his eyes locking on hers. Something fierce flickered there. Not anger, but something closer to fear. "If I give you back," he said slowly, "I lose more than my people. I lose—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. He looked away. Elizabeth's breath caught. She didn't need him to finish the sentence. She already knew. In that moment, she realized the truth she had tried to deny. She was no longer just a captive. She had become his weakness, his undoing, and perhaps his salvation. But his choice would not only shape his fate, it would decide hers. If he gave her up, she might live. If he kept her, they both might die. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, they both felt the same dangerous truth settle between them like smoke. The time for choices was running out. The days that followed were heavier than the ones before. Every step across the wilderness felt like it carried not only the weight of Elizabeth's body, but the weight of his people's growing defiance. The campfires burned colder. The laughter of the young warriors grew sharper, mocking. Even the elders had stopped speaking to him in the tone of respect he once commanded. He felt it, the crumbling of his authority. And still, he would not bend. Elizabeth, too, felt the shift. She walked close to him, no longer because the rope demanded it, but because she knew the space around him was the only safety she had left. Yet her heart ached with guilt. She could see what she had cost him, how his very soul was bleeding because he had chosen her again and again. One night, as the camp slept, he untied her hands fully for the first time. She looked at him in disbelief, rubbing her wrists where the rope had been. "You are free," he murmured. His voice was heavy, as though each word had been carved from stone. "If you run, I will not stop you." Elizabeth's breath caught. Freedom, the thing she had prayed for since the night of her capture, was suddenly in her grasp. Yet when, She looked at the dark hills rolling away under the moonlight. Her legs refused to move. "Why?" she whispered. He looked at her then, and for the first time she saw no mask, no wall of control. Only truth. His voice broke when he answered, "Because I cannot carry this war in my heart any longer. I cannot fight my people, and I cannot fight what you have done to me." Her throat tightened. What have I done to you?" His eyes, dark as the river at night, met hers. "You stole me," he said simply, "from the inside. I did not mean for it. But when I looked beneath your fear, when I saw your courage, I lost my soul." Elizabeth's knees felt weak. She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that nothing had passed between them but fear and survival. Yet she couldn't, because she had felt it too, the strange, unexplainable tether between them. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind stirring through the grass. Then, with a slow certainty, he reached for her hand, not to claim her, not to bind her, but simply to hold it. His calloused palm was warm, trembling faintly against her skin. "You must choose now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go back to your people, or stay, and make me an enemy to mine. Either way, I am already yours." Elizabeth's heart pounded. She thought of the home she had lost, of the family that might still be waiting, of the world she belonged to. Then she thought of the man before her, the one who had defied his own tribe, risked his own life, all for the sake of a woman who had been nothing but a captive. Her lips trembled as she whispered back, "I don't want to run." For the first time since she had met him, his face softened, not with triumph, but with something fragile, reverent. He bowed his head, as though surrendering not to her, but to the truth that had bound them both. The choice was made. Dangerous, impossible, yet undeniable. When dawn came, and the whispers rose again in the camp, Elizabeth and the warrior stood side by side. Whatever storm would fall upon them, they would face it together, because in that night's confession, one soul had been surrendered, and another had been claimed, and neither of them would ever belong to themselves again.